Welcome, everyone. So, when Mike and I first spoke about tonight's talk, he said that you guys really enjoy having more of a conversational situation, which is great. And then he said, why don't you do a comparison of the five ranks of Tozan? I gave him three choices. So I'm going to do I'm going to do my best to keep this as brief as possible, but it is a bit of a complex subject. So, um, just so I have your understanding and patience. So, as far as a reading for tonight, I was thinking about different things, and I kind of came down to a song that I happened to hear on on my stereo when I was driving, and it's a great song, and you guys know it. It's "In the Presence of the Lord." Do you know that one? Yes, Eric Clapton. It was off of an album years ago. This is back in his classic days. And the line is basically, I have finally found a place to live like I've never known before. I have finally found a way to live in the presence of the Lord. It's a great song. So I don't know if you guys know Clapton, but if you don't, you should learn Clapton. So what does that mean, and why the use of the word Lord? Well, it's going to get clearer here, because that's not a word that is familiar for most Western Buddhists. Now, if you're talking to Buddhists from Asia, then that word would be fairly common. In fact, most people from the southern region and even some of those from the northern region will use the Sanskrit term Bhagavad. And if you look at the Pali Canon, which is a collection of writings attributed to the Buddha Shakyamuni, they use that address a lot, Bhagavad, and that just means Lord. So what does that mean? So we'll talk, or it could be master, but that's a very common term. So when we're looking at how to compare these things, we're going to start with the five ranks of Tozan. Have you guys ever heard of that before? A little bit. So Tozan became a well-known teacher. In his own lifetime, he wasn't that well known, and the order and group he founded eventually died out. But it was later that he was appreciated and actually revered for his insights. And Sozan, have you ever heard of Sozan? So Sozan and Tozan, their ideas were brought together to create the Soto denomination of Zen Buddhism. So they took the first two letters from each of them. So that's where that comes from. And have you ever heard of the Sandokai? So the Sandokai was a poem that to this day, in every Zen center, every Zen temple in the world, that is recited as a part of liturgy. And Michael shared with you at the beginning, because I don't know that you do it all the time, but we do it about all the time, is a translation that I did some years ago, and that Sandokai liturgy is where the five ranks come from. And so just kind of give that little bit of background. One of the things I want to say about Buddhists is that there's an ordering fetish that they have. Like there's no more systematic, Buddhists love to put things into categories and orders, right? And so a lot of our sutras are very different from other sacred writings because they come across more like textbooks. Like the famous Buddhadharma, it reads more like a psychological textbook than it does anything else. There are famous people like Sam Harris. You've ever heard of Sam Harris? He's made a lot of that and said about how this is so. And it's true. And I think it's because that systematic sort of approach is to get your ideas down so that you can practice them in a certain way. Because the ultimate thing to always remember is no one can teach you nirvana. Like no one can teach that to you. The Dharma is a boat to get you to your own experience of nirvana. It's not nirvana itself. So that's why there's all these myriad ways to get you to that experience. And they vary greatly over the last 3,000 years because cultures and people are different. And of course, our four directions is my effort to try to speak that language in our contemporary setting. So is that clear so far? All right. Now, the relationship that Tozan was trying to help people understand was a relationship between the absolute and the relative. Now, Michael told me that you have been doing some study of Nagarjuna or Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna was the Buddhist philosopher that kind of put that concept together. And we have our own version of it in the four directions as well. But that's what Tozan's effort was. He was trying to show a practical process that one goes through in practice. And that this practice isn't something that happens only once, but that it happens as each aspect of your skandhic karmic life comes into harmony. Now, when I say that, you guys are aware of the 5 skandhas? You talked about that at all?
We've talked about that a lot. Come on.
So the 5 skandhas, or the 5 aggregates, are... All right, there you go, there you go. So, sorry, I was using the Sanskrit. So the 5 aggregates or heaps are ways of understanding 2 things. One is to understand the relationship, object-subject relationship, but it's also there to understand the unfolding and evolution of one's being. And that's how we approach it in the 4 directions. So it becomes a sort of a template for everything. And there's just so much that's taken from there. Well, the 5 ranks of Tozan come from there as well. So everything in here is about the 5 aggregates in one fashion or another. But it's about them in a way to understand the process of the cycle of awakening. Is that clear so far?
Could you just go through the 5 aggregates? Because I don't remember them all.
I can, yes. So the first aggregate is the inherited stuff. So we talk about that, in old language, they would say your karmic inheritance from your previous experience, before this experience. I'm careful not to say reincarnation because factually it's not reincarnation. Buddhism is very sophisticated when it comes to consciousness. And it sees consciousness as sort of quanta or units of experience that are all interconnected to each other. So the idea of an atomic center, which is where we get the word Atma, is not taught in Buddhism because it doesn't see consciousness that way. That's an older way to see consciousness as something inside of you, and then when the body dies, that invisible part of you goes on. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with maybe visualizing it that way, but it's not how Buddhists see it. We see consciousness as everything. So we, several thousand years ago, came up with the theories and practices of that folks like Donald Hoffman at MIT is doing right now. Only he used math to get there. But he comes up with the same exact thing, and he'll tell you that. If you go online, watch his YouTube talks, read his one bestseller, which is the argument against nothing, something like that. I forget the title. The argument against reality is that it's this idea that everything is consciousness. Saraja Penrose, same view. So we had this view a long time ago. So when we say, when we don't really talk about here, there, or come back, because most beliefs about the afterlife or the next experience is you either stay put You go somewhere else or you come back. And so Buddhists don't really hold to that because they find it too simplistic. But again, I don't have a problem with analogy and metaphor as long as it's understood to not be necessarily the thing. So that's the first one. So for us, we talk about it as that's our inherited genetics. And so we come into the world not as, the old idea was tabula rasa, right? But we know that's not true anymore. And so the Buddhists always kind of knew this. They believed, and again, probably using more native Indian ideas, that you come into the world with this previous karma. So we talk about it as inherited or hereditary or genetic stuff. It may be much more than that, but we talk about it at least at that level. That's the first. There's a great guy, he was a professor at Harvard when I was there, Steven Pinker. Have you ever heard of Steven Pinker? Yes? So Steven Pinker, if you want to talk about tabula rasa and the meaning of that, he's probably one of the best experts in that area. But we've always thought that. The second, what's that? He is, yes, yes. One of his great books is Our Better Angels, but it's about this thick, so just be prepared. But he gives the most cogent understanding of that first idea of tabula rasa versus inherited, in my opinion. So the second stage, or second aggregate now, takes place from in utero all the way up to about 7 or 8 years of age. And it's during that stage where the yin energy is most potent. Now, some would say the feminine energy, and traditionally you might say it's the mother's energy, but we try to stay in big terms and talk about it as yin. And then around 8 or 9, the third aggregate or third stage comes into play, and that is perception, right? And that second stage, just to back up for a moment, is about feeling or affect, both physically and mentally. The third stage is about perception, and that's yang. And that's the idea, perception of really how power works in the world. And that happens to little humans around 8 or 9. And we also know from neurology today that that's precisely when there's a change in the brain of children, where that part of their brain that is more rational thinking actually starts to wire itself then. So the Buddhists were observing this. They were great psychologists and observers, and they didn't have the technology we did, or maybe the sophistication, but they kind of had it right. The fourth stage is the conception aggregate. And that happens anywhere from post-adolescence all the way up into around age 30. Some will push it as far as like the mid-30s. Somewhere in that range, you develop a conception of who you are. It starts around the puberty years, and that's where you're trying to figure out, who am I in the world? And that's why that stage is difficult, because we're trying to always struggle between conformity and non-conformity, being an individual or being part of a group. So it's a tough time. And people used to believe that was resolved, around 20 or 21. And Buddhists always thought it was up until about 35. And we know now from neurology, for example, that the wiring in your brain doesn't finish till about 25. So it's really kind of cool, I think, how you can relate these. And then the fifth aggregate is the establishment of an identity. Now, again, this identity is made up of these aggregates. So when you go out and walking around the world, you're not aware necessarily of all these aggregates, but when someone yells your name, unconsciously, if you will, all those aggregates are there. And so that's the 5 aggregates. Now, an object relation version, you do the same thing. So you have the initial object, right? So a tree, so I can touch it, I can smell it, etc. And then I have, it'll conjure up some kind of connection, right? So let's say when I was little, I played under trees and I like climbing trees. So the emotion to that will be positive. Well, let's say I climbed a tree and I fell out of it and broke my leg and I couldn't play all summer. So now it's negative. So that's the second stage. My way of dealing with it emotionally is caused by my experience. The third version of it is the perception. Now I have this tree and I had my ideas about it, but now I'm perceiving what a tree means. And then the fourth stage is the conception of the tree, whereas if I love trees, then it's going to be a good conception. Maybe even if I broke my arm or my leg. But if I don't like trees, maybe my parent took me out under an old elk tree and always used to beat me when I was young, the trees are going to be negative, right? And finally, the fifth stage is where anytime anybody talks about a tree, all that's there. So I really am not objective about trees. All that stuff is there. So take that and put it on any object you wish, person, place, or thing. But that's the basic sort of dharmic explanation. So is that good? All right. So now we'll go to Tozan. Go ahead.
You know, often when reading this, you will ask a question.
Yeah, I'm having questions.
And, you know, and you'll
But
take
try to
me
be
off
good.
for like, you know, a little bit. I just want you to be conscious. They're like, you know, they'll take me and I'll go off for 20 minutes. And I'll never come back. I'll be like, oh my gosh, what was the topic?
Well, I'll try not to do that. Try not to do that. All right. So when we get to actually talking about Tozan's 5 ranks, or it's also known as 5 houses, the writing of the original version is like koans. Are you familiar with koans? So the language is like a koan. And the 5 ranks or 5 houses was used differently by different people. Hakuin, who is like the father of Rinzai Zen or Linqi Zen, he was very much about using them systematically as a way to develop your practice. So like the Gateless Gate, the Book of Serenity, the Blue Cliff Record, things like that. There were collections of koans. So Hakuin would use Tozan's 5 houses to do 2 things. One, organize the koans into different groupings, and then use them at the end of your graduation of going through the other 3 books. So that's the way he used it. Okay, so that's all the historical sort of background on it. So I'm going to use the term that's very popular in Asia, and you can find this back in, going back to folks like Kukushu and modern teachers like Peggy Kennett, Zen teachers, and they all used this language, and so it was very popular. So I just thought I would use the same thing. And so what it's talking about is the Lord of the house. So if you think of the 5 stages as a house, that's the ego self in our language. The Lord of the house is the true self. So when I'm using the word Lord, or we're then using the Lord in this reference, they're talking about the true self. So the first, and this is called, just for your edification, in Sanskrit, it's called Bhava Dipati. Bhava Dipati. And so the first is, now when I say the eternal, that's a very popular term in the old ways of doing this. Most people get it wrong. Just remember this: the eternal has nothing to do with time. So if you use that word or you use that reference, it means there's nothing to do with time. Because sometimes eternal is conflated with immortal, or, you know, on and on, different terms. But it doesn't mean that. It means now, when there's no attachment to any sense of future or past. No attachment to any sense of time. Okay? So the first degree or rank or house is the eternal invites The transitory. The transitory. So the transitory in our Four Directions version would be talking about the ego self or the skondic self that I just talked about. So it's the transitory and contingent. So it's the idea that there is no such thing as a static sense of being. Everything is constantly in transition, constantly changing. So what does this mean, the eternal invites the transitory? It means that the way the universe is set up to invite you to become awakened. So when you compare this to the first noble truth in the Southern Buddhist version of things, it would be the first, what we call the first principle of oneness, suffering as the common denominator. So the meaning of suffering, and I talk about it in my newest book, Mere Buddhism, suffering has always been understood as a clue to the meaning of the universe. It leads conscious beings to awakening. So that's one way of understanding how the internal invites the transitory. You see how it kind of puts a spin on it that's a little bit playful, a little imaginative, and there's lots of ways you could talk about it, but it basically means that this universe, and this is a hard thing for a lot of people to understand, particularly Westerners, I think. This universe is not something to be fixed or made better. It just is. And out of that isness comes the pain of being conscious. So if beings evolve to a point where they become conscious, and then particularly self-conscious, it's painful. And there's no way around it. However, the pain of consciousness is not the problem. It's the suffering that comes out of the pain. And the suffering is an add-on we do by resisting the pain or telling ourselves stories about what the pain means. Is that clear? Okay. So that's the first rank, and that's how it relates to the first noble truth. Suffering allows us to see that something's not right. Dukkha is the Pali term. The second rank, let me go through and then we can do that. So the second is the...
Jennifer will take you away.
That's great. I love it, but I want to be mindful of your time for it too. So the transitory accepts the invitation of the eternal. Now you see how it's using a sort of storyline sort of thing? They would also say the Lord of the house invites the guest. So the guest is another word for the transitory. And then that second one would be the guest accepts the invitation of the eternal, or the Lord of the house. And that relates to the second idea in the Four Noble Truths of Tana. And Tana is really what we would call the second principle of oneness, and that is change, the constant and contingent and transitory nature of things. And Tana is sometimes translated as craving or desiring or thirst. Thirst is probably the better one. And there's Tana and Chana. And the difference between them, T and C, is that it's, in other words, it gets people wrong a lot because they think, well, the idea, it's like an old kung fu movie. I should learn to be desireless and non-craving and not have any wishes or anything like that. It sounds like a bad kung fu movie. But the real meaning of it is there's nothing wrong with desires. There's nothing wrong with goals. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. But will it quench it? In other words, if you understand the object as what it can do and what it can't do, then enjoy it. But if you start to think that the object is going to sate that thirst, then it's Tana. That's what creates suffering. Interestingly, if you like old horror movies, the mummy movies, it's Tana leaves that keep the mummy alive. So I thought that was kind of cool. So is that clear so far? So that's the relationship to that one. The third one is the transitory experiences the wisdom and compassion of the eternal. Or if you use the other version, it would be the guest experiences the hospitality of the host, the Lord of the house. And the way that relates to is the third noble truth, which is Nirodha. And Nirodha is the third, what we call the third principle of oneness. And that is understanding the self not as something that exists separately on its own, but as an interdependent experience. So that this idea of self goes from being what the old language was, the old skin bag, to boundless. So it's identifying not with a limited sense of consciousness, but an unlimited sense of consciousness, which you could call Buddha consciousness. And so when that relates to the third, as I said, Nirodha, it's talking about the same thing. It's just saying that the self is really interdependent and boundless. And what the guest of the house learns is that it is boundless, or Buddha. The fourth one is the eternal manifests through the transitory. So 30 seconds ago, I was just saying that the language of using the Lord of the house and the guest is that what the guest finally understands is that this is their home. This is where they've always belonged. I kind of like that. And when you relate it to the Four Noble Truths, it's Marga, or the Eightfold Path, which is really just three categories of wisdom, contemplation, and loving action or healing action. So the Eightfold Path is really just another way of talking about the three foundations. But that's the relationship to that. And finally, the fifth one in Tozan is the oneness of the eternal and the transitory. And what does that mean? It means now the guest has become the host. There's no difference between them anymore. Now, there is no, technically, fifth noble truth. But there actually is. And that's the fruit. Right? So you have dukkha, tanha, nirodha, marga. The fifth is nirvana. The fruit is nirvana. And the reason it's not mentioned is because, like I said before, you can't teach people that. That is the fruit of the practice. So that's the 5 ranks. Now, as a bonus, before we're done, I'm going to relate it to our tradition. Since you're part of our Sangha, our tradition, I'm going to relate it to our tradition. The first is to rediscover your true self. The second is to understand the nature of your ego self. The third is to begin to use the power of the practices to experience awakening. And the fourth is to learn to trust in your true self, to not let the ego self drive the show. And the fifth is the practice of using the idea of Genjo-kon, which is the idea of the thing that arises in your daily life that hooks you, and then processing it with the practices, particularly like the 4 questions. So that's our version of it. And one last little bonus for you, the liturgical version. Our liturgical cycle and everything follows the 5 ranks. And the first is to embrace the shadow. That's Sagaki. The second is awakening to the light, Satori. Embodying the light, Nirvana. Rebirth, Hanamatsuri. And Obon, Sangha. Sangha. All right, so that's it. So now we can do the questions.